Hi, I'm Paul Guppy. I am Vice President for the Washington Policy Center, and this is our regular update of what is going on in the state legislature and some of the issues that we're working on and bills that are moving that maybe you didn't hear about, but could have a real big impact on the lives of all of us if they end up getting passed into law. So off we go with a list of issues that I have here. So first of all, this is week 5 of the legislative session, and it's, for those who are counting, it's legislative day 34 out of a planned 105-day session. And as I mentioned before, the major job for the legislature in odd numbered years, every 2 years, is to pass a 2-year state budget by the time the legislative session is scheduled to end in late April, but definitely by July 1st, which is when the state's fiscal year starts. I can already predict the Democrats have strong majorities in the House and the Senate, and they hold the governor's office. So they should have no problem passing a state budget, not looking at a state government shutdown or anything like that. However, it's early days, and as we get later in the session, I'll give updates about what's going on with the budget. In the meantime, there's a lot of committee activity, various bills moving. Later in February, there is a committee cutoff date when policy bills are supposed to have passed their committee of origin. And once that cutoff comes, I'll have an assessment as to how many bills made it and are still alive and how many of it died. Over 1,500 bills have been introduced so far. Not all of them are going to get a hearing, but here are some of the ones that our staff is working on. So one, for example, is SB 5476 that was introduced in the Senate Commerce and Labor Committee. Our staff expert, Pam Lewison, who herself is a farmer, testified on this bill because it is about imposing the state's rigid overtime work rules on agricultural communities. So ever since minimum wage laws started in the 1930s, agriculture, farms, ranches have always been exempted. And the reason is because farms don't operate on an urban factory business type model. The work year is very flexible. There are slow times and there's harvest time. And farmers have always needed that flexibility to ensure safe food production and that harvest is brought in on time. That reasoning and that tradition does not impress the Democrats who are in Olympia, most of whom, by the way, represent the Seattle area. So they seem to have a tin ear when it comes to listening to people in the eastern part of the state or even Western Washington that are engaged in agriculture. So what Pam pointed out is this bill would allow some modest flexibility in the overtime law for 12 weeks a year. During harvest time only, the overtime rule would be not even eliminated. It would just be eased so that farm workers could work longer hours, get paid for that, but that farmers and ranchers wouldn't have to pay the high overtime rates. What has been happening is that they have cut back work hours, which reduces farm worker income. And most of the people that testified in favor of this bill for flexibility were farm workers themselves, and then including Pam, our analyst, to explain this to the committee. The pushback they got from Senator Saldana is for her to explain to the farm workers that they don't know what their own economic interests are. So here she was arguing with constituents who had traveled to Olympia or were appearing on Zoom to tell the legislature how that law affected them. And she just wasn't buying it. So we're not sure what's going to happen with this. Farmers were accused of structural racism and for all kinds of accusations because of the way they treat farm workers, when it was actually the workers themselves who said it. They wanted flexibility during harvest time so they could work longer hours and make more money. That made perfect sense. So we'll see what ends up happening with that bill. Another agriculture related bill that Pam testified on is HB 1720. This issue has been around for a number of years in the legislature. It has to do with the buffers that are required next to streams to provide shade for fish, to help salmon recovery. And the argument is, how much land is the state going to take out of food production by requiring farmers to leave shade, trees, and brush along streams? The farmers argue for around 50 to 100 feet. They say that that makes perfect sense. And the science backs them up. The vast majority of shade and temperature moderation that the water needs in the summertime for fish is accomplished by that standard. What some Democrats are proposing is a buffer of 250 feet on either side of any waterway. And of course, farmers are pointing out that that takes thousands of acres of food production, agricultural land out of food production, and it's not very workable. This bill seems to have a huge amount of support. Pam, who attended the hearing, told us that it was interesting to see how many lawmakers testified in favor of it, so that's encouraging, and that the science shows that with a voluntary land buffer program, the state can achieve protection for salmon and fish while preserving farmland. So we're hopeful that that bill moves forward. Two other bills on education that I'll touch on quickly. Again, hearings that Lee Finna, our education expert, attended are SB 5442 and HB 1744. So there's good news and bad news here. SB 5442 is a sneaky way of trying to repeal the state's charter school law. Now, we've read this bill carefully. Of course, the word repeal doesn't actually appear in it. So you have to put the pieces together. What the bill does is requires state regulation and oversight of charter schools, would require charter schools to meet all kinds of new regulations that they don't have to follow now. And what Leave pointed out in her analysis to the committee is that's the same as repeal, because you're basically just taking away what a charter school is, a public school that's able to operate independently, meet academic standards, take any student that applies, have a strong academic program, but not be part of the school district bureaucracy so that they can provide a better education. That is why charter schools are so popular. So we have 14 charter schools. 2 more are going to open up in the fall. They educate about 4,000 students, which is a fraction of the roughly 1 million students that the public system has. And so the point is, this is a small choice option within public education, and why not preserve it? Especially since virtually every charter school has a waiting list. And of course, you know, we quickly figure out that that's why the bureaucracy is going after charter schools, because they are popular, because they do have waiting lists. So they are seen as competition to regular bureaucratic traditional schools. The WEA union is viciously opposed to charter schools, and we're very confident that that's where this bill came from. We'll see what happens there. Later that same afternoon, Leave testified in favor of the second bill, HB 1744, because that bill would provide funding fairness for charter school families. So most people don't know that as soon as parents decide to put their child in a charter school, they lose $2,000 to $3,000 of funding for that child. Every charter school is denied local levy funding, capital funding, and some other sources. So what this bill would do is just be to restore that and provide $1,550 more for every charter school student, which doesn't even provide equity, but it brings them closer to what traditional schools get. That bill had a lot of positive testimony in favor of it, including some charter school students who went to the hearing. And so we're hopeful that the Democrats will relent and allow that bill to pass. Another interesting point was that we point out that universal school choice, much beyond charter schools, is now becoming common across the country. Florida has a bill in which that state, if it passes, and Governor DeSantis signs it, would become the 4th state to provide universal school choice for all children within the state. We like that because families can go to a public school, private school, charter school, online education, homeschooling, whatever learning plan works best for the student. So we'll keep tracking that. Next was what we consider anti-democratic legislation, SB 5082, which is to repeal the tax advisory votes that appear on our ballots every cycle. Again, Senator Cooterer, who is the lead Democrat on the committee in promoting this bill, doesn't like the advisory votes because, of course, what happens is the legislature passes a tax. In the next election, that tax is listed on the ballot. It says, do you support or oppose this tax? Overwhelmingly, people vote against the tax, 60, 65, 70%. But of course, the tax itself stays in place because those votes are only advisory. And the lawmakers who voted in favor of the tax do not like the advertising and notice that goes out to the public. And they do not like the fact that people are voting against a tax and then discovering that their vote doesn't mean anything in this case. So our solution was to make the vote mean something, so that if people it's not an advisory vote, make it a binding vote. But instead, the Democrats want to go the other way, which is to take away advisory votes altogether. And what is almost comical is Senator Cooter's attack on citizen advisory votes. And here's what she says. She says that they're corrupt, they're imposters, they lead to voter suppression, and they should be repealed. This bill will probably pass. So we're expecting that advisory votes will be a thing of the past. But what concerns us is the anti-democratic argument that's made that says allowing people to express their views even through an advisory vote should not be allowed. So we consider that voter suppression, and we think it's moving in the wrong direction. But we'll see what the final vote on that is. And another issue that Jason on our staff is following regarding property tax limitation and those issues is Senate Joint Resolution 8204. And that joint resolution indicates that this is a proposed state constitutional amendment. So if it were to pass the legislature, it goes on the ballot, and then the voters would have to pass it as well. And what this does is it's called a property tax cut or limitation. But again, in reading the fine print from this was introduced by Senator Noel Frame. She calls, I should back up, the bill would repeal the uniformity clause in our state constitution. And what that clause says is that all taxpayers in a certain class should pay the same tax rate. So in other words, all property taxes should be at a uniform rate. Senator Frame does not like this proposal, and a lot of the majority Democrats don't, because it prevents them from imposing a progressive property tax. So by repealing the uniform clause, different kinds of property could be taxed in different ways. They could also impose taxes based on the income level of the property owner. So that's another constitutional barrier that they face. She calls the uniformity clause, quote, a relic of the past, that it prevents the legislature from, quote, disincentivizing certain types of property ownership, and that repeal will allow lawmakers to narrowly tailor exemptions so it reaches those who need it most. As soon as you hear language like that from anybody in power, watch out, because they will fill in the blanks as to what kind of property should be taxed, what narrowly tailoring means, and most importantly, who deserves to get a tax break and who doesn't get it. So we think that that just opens the door to a world of horse trading and unfairness and, you know, social justice arguments or structural racist arguments that will be made about property tax policy. But the result is that picking and choosing among groups of residents in the state as to who pays more for property taxes than other people. Right now, the rate is uniform and fair across the board, everybody treated the same. And we're going to be working to preserve that fairness standard. A couple more quick issues I'll touch on. HB 1484 was a bill that Jason testified on to link the death tax to inflation. So we're one of the few states that still has an estate tax, a death tax. Even the federal government repealed the estate tax years ago. We still have one, but it's not indexed to inflation. So the exemption of about $2 million at which you don't have to pay any tax is gradually creeping up. In other words, more and more people are falling under the tax than was intended by the legislature. So we think they should link it to inflation. And even better, we think they should repeal it altogether. The estate tax doesn't bring in enough money to make a difference to the state. It's really more of a symbolic tax to sock it to certain people. And then another bill that we found kind of low key in committee, but we're concerned about, would create a mileage tax pilot program. Of course, they don't call it that. What they're calling it is an odometer reporting program. The way this would work is every year when you relicense your car tabs, you would be required to report the odometer readings on your car. The sponsors of this bill assure everyone that they're not charging a tax. You just report your mileage. That's all there is to it. We, of course, know the legislature better than that. And what they would do is get everybody used to doing the reporting, and then they would apply the tax later. So our analogy is that this is the same thing as if a no income tax state like ours began to tell everybody report your income to us. I mean, we're not going to charge you a tax, but just tell us what your income is, and we'll just keep track of that. So an odometer reading reporting is just a prelude to a mileage tax that one might be coming later on. We'll see what happens with this pilot project. And so that's the wrap up of issues for this week. And we, as always, we thank our supporters. We are supported entirely by voluntary donations, and we really appreciate that. Dave Bose, our communications director, will be hosting another on-the-go live session to report on the legislature. That's on February 14th. And we really appreciate everyone's support. I just made a quick note here at the end of my notes about the controversy that goes on, the heated debate that happens, and our staff is utterly courageous. We have gone way past the point of being worried about name calling, being called nasty things. We just stick to the facts, and we have found that when you have the courage to speak out in the media, in an interview, at a committee hearing, that you get people to listen to you, as long as you're not intimidated. And so we just made a strategic decision that we're going to present our facts and our view the way we want, and not worry about what radical activists are trying to put labels on us. We've just moved beyond that. And so that's how we're able to provide fresh and accurate information. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I'll have another report next week.